Hello, and welcome to Community Kitchen Teachables. My name is Anna, and I work for an organization called Community Kitchen Programs, and I run a program called Calgary's Cooking. So today we are going to continue on with the most common kitchen and cooking questions. So the first question that I do get asked a lot is, what is the difference between baking and broiling? So for example, if a recipe calls for please bake at 325 degrees or please broil for 5 minutes, what does that actually mean and when would you do it? So the biggest difference between baking versus broiling is the heat intensity. Okay, so usually when you are broiling something, you're putting that food item really close to a heat source, and that heat is really high. So think of temperatures close to about that 500 degrees Fahrenheit range. An item that you would broil would be something like an item that requires just a little bit of heat to finish something off. So for example, French onion soup. The cheese that goes on top of the soup has to go under a broiling pan or just right underneath the heat source. And that's just enough to brown it, not as opposed to cooking it. The one thing you want to keep in mind when you set your oven to broil is you never want to walk away from the oven when you have it on broil. Again, broil is intense, high heat, and it's only meant to use as a finishing. Okay, so again, any kind of cut of meat that just needs a little bit of heat on top, things like mac and cheese and you got to melt the cheese on it, French onion soup where you just want to brown the cheese. Sometimes restaurants will also do a dessert called Baked Alaska. And what that is ice cream with meringue on it. And they have to brown the meringue. So a lot of times they'll stick that Baked Alaska just under the heat, just long enough to brown the meringue, but not actually melt the ice cream. Baking, on the other hand, is a temperature that's a lot lower. It's a lot gentler, and it is your most common kitchen term when it comes to using the oven. So a good example of baking temperatures and where you would bake an item would be things like a casserole, or if you're baking a cake, stuff like that. Things that require a little bit longer of a baking time and a little bit more of a gentle heat. What is the difference between a saucepan and a stock pot? A saucepan basically is a pot that will usually, sometimes it will come with a lid, sometimes it won't, but it will usually have one handle on it, such as what I've got here. So a sauce pot or a saucepan, they get used interchangeably, is meant for things like small amounts of stuff. So soup, heating up some chili, maybe melting some butter. That's what a saucepan or a sauce pot is meant for. Now, a stock pot, on the other hand, is generally something that has two handles. This one is a little bit bigger than the saucepan, but it is meant for doing larger items and usually meant to be on the top of the stove for a little bit longer period of time. So think of things like heating up or cooking soup over a long period of time, or spaghetti sauces or stews, that kind of thing. That's where you would use this. Now, the advantage to having the two handles is so that you can easily carry it, lift it off the stovetop, and then carry it to wherever you feel you need to put it. So that is the main difference between the pot, the saucepan, or the stock pot. Some of you who eat cheese may not get to eat your whole cheese right away without it getting older, and you might experience a little bit of mold on it. Is the cheese still good to eat with a bit of mold on it? What do you do about the mold? Do you throw the cheese out? Like, what do you do? And this can cause a little bit of concern because cheese is a little bit more on the expensive side, depending on what type of cheese you get. Hard cheese is what I've got here. It's just a hard cheddar, and sometimes hard cheese can get a mold on it. So then what do? Well, you can take your knife and you can actually cut that little bit of mold away, and then you would take the moldy piece and you would discard it. The rest of the cheese is perfectly fine to eat. Some people like to take a paring knife and they just like to cut around the actual moldy part of the cheese. You can do that as well if you want. You just want to make sure that no matter whether you use the bigger knife or the smaller knife and how much cheese you take off to get rid of the moldy part, that you want to be thorough and get rid of all of the mold. So that will mean that you'll want to make sure that you're cutting the cheese down deep enough to get rid of the mold. And that's how you salvage your cheese. Now, there is cheese out there that is a bit softer and is actually comes purposely with mold around it. For example, brie and camembert. What do you do with that? Do you cut the mold off or do you eat it? Well, that comes down to a preference. Some people do eat the brie with the mold on. I've done that myself. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. If you're not keen on eating the mold that goes around the brie, all you have to do is just chop off the mold, but also remember what you're exposing is a really soft, creamy cheese. So you might want to put that on a cracker. What is the difference between evaporated milk and condensed milk? Condensed milk is milk that has a large amount of sugar added to it. So it is definitely a lot sweeter. It does get used predominantly in a lot of baking recipes. You cannot substitute the two. Evaporated milk, on the other hand, gets used for a lot of savory recipes. For example, adding to stews or adding to soups, adding to sauces to help thicken it up. It's in a lot of Indian cooking as well. You can get lighter versions of evaporated milk. You can also get lighter versions of condensed milk. There is no sugar in evaporated milk. The one thing that the two of them do have in common is a lot of the water has been removed from it. So they both start off as milk, but they get treated just a little bit differently. When do we know the difference between a best before date and an expiration date? I could do a whole video just on this alone. The best before date and the expiration date are actually very, very different from each other. So the most important is the expiration date. This is a date that you should be more concerned with. An expiration date is usually put on a package by the manufacturer when it comes to items that are a little bit more shelf sensitive. So for example, let's think of eggs. On the carton of eggs, there'll always be an expiration date. On a carton of milk, there'll always be an expiration date. Usually those dates are about 2 or 3 weeks out from the time of purchase. What I would suggest to you is to consume those products before the expiration date. When it goes beyond the expiration date, I'd be very careful whether you use that product or not. If in doubt, throw it out. Now, a best before date is something just a little bit different. A best before is more indication on height of freshness. So for example, spice. They'll have a date on there that will be the best before. That doesn't mean that the day after the best before date has expired, that spice is now bad. All it means is that the freshness might come into more question. Usually your best before date, again, depending on the product, can be short, as in a week to 2 weeks, or it could be long, as in 9 to 12 months. Again, it depends on the product. If you're ever in doubt, though, my suggestion is I would go on to a search engine on your computer, and I would look for what is the difference between best before and what is the difference between expiration date. And the reason why I would suggest that is because it depends on the product. And that concludes this session of the most common cooking and kitchen questions. Thank you so much for your time and have a great day.